For 9 years, I had given everything to my husband's technology company: my expertise, my connections, my sleepless nights, and my unwavering commitment. I had sacrificed family gatherings, postponed starting our own family, and worked through severe burnout to transform his struggling startup into an empire worth $85 million. It wasn't just his company to me. It was our shared dream, our legacy, our future. Or so I thought. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the day I first walked into Blake's small office in Austin. It was a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, and just 4 employees huddled around outdated computers. Blake had founded Horizon Tech 3 years earlier with a promising AI algorithm for predictive analytics, but the company was drowning in debt and struggling to find market fit. His investors were threatening to pull out, and his small team was on the verge of quitting. I wasn't looking to join a failing startup. With my MBA from Wharton and 5 years at a top consulting firm, I had offers from Google and Microsoft sitting on my table. But there was something about Blake's vision, and yes, about Blake himself, that made me take the risk. His passion was infectious, his technical brilliance undeniable. When he looked at me across his cluttered desk and said, "I don't need another consultant telling me what's wrong. I need someone who can fix it," I felt a challenge I couldn't walk away from. 3 months, I told him. I'll give you 3 months to turn this around. If we can't show measurable progress, we both move on. He agreed immediately. Those 3 months turned into 9 years, and they were the most exhilarating and exhausting years of my life. The first year was about survival. I restructured the entire business model, pivoting from selling directly to small businesses to targeting enterprise clients who could sustain higher price points. I negotiated with creditors, buying us time. I spent weeks on the road, sleeping, in budget hotels, pitching our solution to CIOs who initially wouldn't even take my calls. "You're wasting your time," Blake would tell me when another potential client ghosted us after weeks of meetings. "Maybe we should just accept one of the acquisition offers." "No," I insisted. "We're too close." I believed in what we had built, more than even he did sometimes. When Westmark Financial finally signed on as our first major client, paying $1.2 million for a 3-year contract, we celebrated by splurging on actual office chairs to replace the folding metal ones we'd been using. Blake proposed to me that same night, and I said yes without hesitation. We were partners in every sense now. The second and third years were about growth and proving our concept. I built a sales team from scratch, recruiting talented people by offering equity instead of competitive salaries. I crafted our marketing strategy, positioning Horizon Tech as the boutique alternative to the tech giants, more adaptable, more personalized, more innovative. When our competitors launched similar products, I pushed our development team to stay 2 steps ahead, leveraging Blake's original algorithm in ways even he hadn't imagined. By year 4, we had 45 employees and a real office in downtown Austin. Revenue had hit $12 million, and we were profitable for the first time. Blake and I got married in a small ceremony and then immediately flew to San Francisco to close our Series B funding round. Our honeymoon was a weekend in Napa Valley squeezed between investor meetings. "Most couples wouldn't call this a honeymoon," Blake joked as we reviewed pitch decks in our hotel room. "We're not most couples," I reminded him, "and this is just the beginning." Years 5 through 7 were about expansion. I spearheaded our international growth, establishing offices in London and Singapore. I negotiated complex partnerships with industry leaders that put our technology into systems serving millions of users worldwide. When market shifts threatened certain product lines, I orchestrated swift pivots that not only saved us, but opened entirely new revenue streams. Blake was brilliant with technology and product vision, but he relied on me for everything else: strategy, operations, client relationships, team building. We were perfect complements. He created, I executed. He dreamed, I built. Behind every major decision, I was there, often staying up until 3 a.m. analyzing data or rehearsing crucial presentations. During a particularly grueling expansion phase, I developed insomnia that lasted months. My doctor warned me about burnout, but I brushed it off. The company needs me, I explained, as if that justified the toll on my health. When I finally collapsed from exhaustion during a board meeting, Blake promised we'd slow down, hire more executives to share the load. But we never really did. There was always another milestone to reach, another competitor to outmaneuver, another opportunity too good to pass up. The sacrifices were personal, too. 3 years into our marriage, we had talked about starting a family, but the timing was never right. Just after this funding round, we'd say, or once we launched the new platform. The company became our child, demanding and receiving all our attention. By year 8, Horizon Tech had become a recognized leader in enterprise AI solutions. We had over 300 employees across 3 continents. Our client list included Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. Annual revenue had reached $58 million. What had once been a struggling startup was now a formidable force in the industry. Blake became the public face of the company, speaking at major tech conferences and being profiled in business magazines. I was content to work behind the scenes, driving growth and ensuring operations ran smoothly. We were still partners, still aligned in our vision, or so I believed. Year 9 was our breakout year. We launched our most ambitious platform yet, an AI solution that revolutionized how enterprises handled predictive analytics. The market response was overwhelming. In 6 months, we signed $27 million in new contracts. Our valuation soared to $85 million. Investors who had once been skeptical were now calling daily, eager to get in on our next funding round. Acquisition offers rolled in from tech giants, each one more generous than the last. Blake and I spent long evenings debating our next move: scale independently or join forces with a larger company. I had given everything to build Horizon Tech. My expertise in scaling businesses, my network of industry connections, my health, and even the possibility of starting a family. The company's DNA was as much mine as it was Blake's. Every major client relationship, every strategic pivot, every crisis averted, my fingerprints were on all of it. What I didn't know then was that while I was securing our company's future, Blake was already planning to replace me with someone from his past, someone I never imagined would threaten everything I had built. It happened on a Thursday evening in September. We were hosting a dinner at Lumiere, the most exclusive restaurant in Austin, celebrating our biggest quarter yet. The private dining room overlooked the city skyline, the same skyline I used to stare at from our tiny first office, dreaming of the day Horizon Tech would be a recognized name in those gleaming towers. Around the table sat our executive team and their partners, all dressed in their finest, sipping champagne that cost more per bottle than our entire monthly office rent in those early days. The conversation flowed easily. Jokes about the early struggles, pride in recent accomplishments, excited chatter about the future. Even our normally reserved CTO was animated, describing the next-generation algorithms his team was developing. Should have noticed something was off with Blake. He was quieter than usual, checking his phone frequently. When he did speak, his enthusiasm seemed forced, but I was caught up in the moment, in our success, in the culmination of everything we had worked for. Earlier that day, we had received a valuation report placing Horizon Tech at $85 million, AT, number that still seemed surreal despite my meticulous financial projections having predicted it. As dessert was being served, Blake stood up, glass in hand. The room quieted immediately. "I want to thank everyone for being part of this incredible journey," he began, his voice steady, practiced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 9 years ago, Horizon Tech was just an idea, a struggling startup that most people had written off. Approving nods around the table. I smiled up at my husband, expecting the usual acknowledgement of our partnership, the we that had built this company together. We've come further than I ever imagined possible, he continued. And now we're entering a new phase. One that requires fresh perspectives and new leadership approaches. My smile faltered slightly. This wasn't part of any script we had discussed. We had been planning to announce an expansion into European markets, not leadership changes. Which is why, Blake said, pausing to glance down at me briefly before addressing the entire table again. I'm excited to announce that Vanessa Peterson will be joining Horizon Tech as our new Chief Operating Officer, effective next month. Vanessa Peterson. The name hit me like a physical blow. Blake's college girlfriend, his ex from before we'd met, the woman he'd once described as brilliant but impossible to work with during one of our rare conversations about past relationships. Vanessa brings exceptional experience from her time at Oracle and Salesforce, Blake continued, as if he hadn't just dropped a bomb into the middle of our celebration. Her expertise in scaling enterprise software companies is exactly what we need at this juncture. I sat completely still, my champagne glass halfway to my lips, frozen in disbelief. Coup, my position, the role I had defined, shaped, and executed for 9 years. The title didn't matter. I had been functioning as COO since day one, even if we had only formalized it in year 3. She'll be taking over operations, strategy, and client relationships, Blake added, his voice never wavering, allowing me to focus more on product vision and innovation. Operations, strategy, client relationships, everything I had built, everything that was mine. Around the table, reactions varied. Our CFO, Marcus, couldn't hide his shock, his eyes darting between Blake and me. Jen, our CMO, studied her dessert intently, clearly uncomfortable. Others nodded along, either oblivious to the significance or already briefed on this bombshell. In fact, Blake said, reaching for his phone, Vanessa wanted to join us tonight, but had a previous commitment. She sent a video message, though. He tapped his screen and turned it toward the table. And there she was, Vanessa Peterson, sleek dark hair, sharp cheekbones, confident smile, looking exactly like the LinkedIn profile picture I had studied years ago during a moment of insecurity I'd never admitted to Blake. Hello, Horizon team. Her voice rang clear through Blake's phone speaker. I'm thrilled to be joining such an innovative company at this pivotal moment. Blake has told me so much about the amazing culture and talent you've built together. Together. The word echoed in my mind. When had they been talking? How long had this been planned? I'm especially looking forward to working with all of you, to take Horizon to the next level. See you in a few weeks. The video ended. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but felt eternal. Let's raise a glass, Blake said, seemingly oblivious to my shock. To Horizon's next chapter. Glasses, lifted around the table. Mine remained on the tablecloth. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. As conversation gradually resumed around me, Marcus leaned over. Did you know about this? He whispered. I gave an almost imperceptible shake of my head, not trusting my voice. The rest of the dinner passed, in a blur. I maintained my composure somehow, nodding at appropriate moments, even answering a few questions about the European expansion we had actually planned to announce. But inside, a storm was brewing. Confusion, betrayal, rage, all battling for dominance. As we gathered our things to leave, Blake placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the door as if nothing had changed. As if he hadn't just publicly replaced me with his ex-girlfriend. The car's waiting outside, he said casually. In the elevator, surrounded by our colleagues, I maintained silence. In the lobby, I smiled and bid goodnight to our team. In the back of the town car, as we pulled away from the restaurant, I finally turned to Blake. What the hell was that? My voice was quiet but laced with 9 years of betrayal. He had the audacity to look surprised. What? Vanessa Peterson? Your ex? As COO? Taking over everything I've built? Blake sighed, loosening his tie. I was going to tell you this weekend. The board and I have been discussing it for months. We need someone with experience scaling companies beyond the $100 million mark. Experience? I stared at him in disbelief. I built this company from $4 million in debt to $85 million in value. Yes, and you've done an amazing job, he said, his tone patronizing. But Vanessa has taken 2 companies through IPO. She knows how to operate at the level we're heading toward. The car stopped at a red light, illuminating his face in crimson. In that moment, I saw something I had never seen before, or perhaps had refused to see. Blake wasn't looking at me as his partner, his equal. He was looking at me as someone who had served a purpose and was now being replaced. This isn't just a business decision, I said, the realization dawning on me. How long have you been talking to her? The light turned green. Blake turned away. How long, Blake? We reconnected at the TechCrunch conference in San Francisco, he finally admitted. 6 months ago. 6 months. While I had been securing our largest client to date. While I had been working 18-hour days preparing for our board presentation. While I had been building his company, his legacy. She'll be reporting to me, of course, he added, as if that made any difference. You'll still have an important role. Director of Business Development, maybe. Or you could lead the European expansion. The car pulled up to our downtown condo building. I couldn't go up there with him. Couldn't pretend this was a normal disagreement we could resolve overnight. Stop the car, I said. Don't be dramatic. Blake sighed. Let's go upstairs and discuss this rationally. Stop the car. Each word was ice. The driver, sensing the tension, pulled over. I opened the door and stepped out, not knowing where I was going. Only that I couldn't spend another second sitting next to the man who had just destroyed everything I thought we had built together. Where are you going? Blake called after me. I didn't answer. There was no answer to give. My world had just imploded, and I had no idea what came next. I walked for hours that night, my heels clicking against the Austin pavement, each step punctuated by the vibration of my phone, Blake calling, then texting, then calling again. I silenced it without looking at the messages. The warm September air felt thick, suffocating. My mind raced through every conversation, every meeting, every business trip Blake had taken in the past 6 months, searching for signs I'd missed. By midnight, I found myself at the Horizon Tech office building. I used my keycard to enter, nodding mechanically at the night security guard who was used to seeing executives work late. The office was empty, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast long shadows across the space I had designed 3 years ago. I walked to my office, and stood in the doorway. Everything in it represented a milestone in our journey. The small cactus on the windowsill, a gift from our first major client. The framed photo of Blake and me at the TechCrunch Awards, the wall of whiteboards where I'd mapped out our international expansion strategy just last week. I stepped inside and closed the door, finally allowing my perfectly maintained mask to slip. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of my desk, knuckles turning white. Breath came in short, sharp bursts. The room seemed to spin as 9 years of memories collided with the reality of Blake's betrayal. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to destroy the office as thoroughly as Blake had just destroyed our partnership. Instead, I forced myself to breathe deeply, counting each inhale and exhale like the meditation app had taught me during my bout with insomnia. Control. I needed control. And information. I sat down at my computer and logged in. if Vanessa Peterson was joining as COO next month. There would be documentation, board meeting minutes, employment contracts, email threads I'd been excluded from. It took less than 20 minutes to find everything. Blake hadn't even bothered to hide the trail. Board minutes from 3 months ago mentioned succession planning for operational leadership. Email exchanges between Blake and the board chair discussed Vanessa's unique qualifications and previous connection to the founder. An employment contract, already signed by both parties, outlined a compensation package that made my own look pitiful by comparison. But it was an email thread from 6 weeks ago that stopped my breath entirely. From Blake Harrison to Vanessa. Peterson subject, Next steps Vanessa, the board is fully on board with the transition plan. They agree that your experience is exactly what Horizon needs at this stage. I've drafted an announcement for the executive team dinner on September 12th. We'll position it as a strategic addition, with you taking over operations, strategy, and client relationships. Only concern is Sarah's reaction. She's been running point on these areas since the beginning. I'm thinking we offer her director of business development or something to oversee the European expansion. She'll be disappointed, but she'll understand it's what's best for the company. Maybe we could discuss more over dinner tomorrow. The usual. Place? Blake. The usual place. They had a usual place. From Vanessa Peterson to Blake Harrison. Subject, Next steps, sounds perfect. Looking forward to dinner and figuring out the Sarah situation. She's been a great caretaker for Horizon, but we both know the company needs more than that now. Don't worry. I'm sure she'll accept whatever role you offer. After all, it's your company caretaker. The word seared itself into my brain. 9 years of sweat, tears, missed family events, health issues, reduced to caretaker. And those final words, after all, it's your company. I read and reread those exchanges, each word, another knife. The most painful part wasn't even Vanessa's dismissal of my contributions. It was Blake's, his casual agreement that I would accept whatever lesser role they deigned to offer me, his complete disregard for our partnership, both professional and personal. My phone vibrated again. Blake, I picked up this time. Where are you? His voice was a mixture of annoyance and concern. I've been worried sick. I'm at the office, I replied, my voice unnaturally calm. At this hour? Come home. We need to talk about this rationally. I've seen the emails, Blake. The line went silent. All of them. A long pause. You shouldn't be accessing confidential board communications. Of all the responses he could have chosen, he went with that. Not denial, not an apology. A reminder of corporate protocol. I built the communication systems for this company, I said, the same eerie calm in my voice. I implemented the board portal. I know what's confidential and what isn't. Sarah, you're upset. I understand. But this transition is about what's best for Horizon. Don't. The word came out sharp, cutting him off. Don't pretend this is just business. Not when you've been meeting her at the usual place for months. Another silence. Then, that's not fair. We've been discussing business. When were you going to tell me? If Marcus hadn't asked me at dinner if I knew about it, would you have just let me find out when she showed up at the office? I was going to tell you this weekend, he insisted. I just needed to get the announcement out of the way first. Get it out of the way. Like a distasteful errand. Like my feelings were an inconvenience to be managed. I'll be staying at a hotel tonight, I said. Don't be dramatic. Come home and we'll sort this out. There it was again. The dismissal. The diminishing. My valid reaction labeled as dramatic. My fundamental issue with his betrayal reduced to something that could be sorted out over a nightcap. I'll send you the name of the hotel where you can have my things delivered tomorrow, I said, then ended the call before he could respond. I sat in the silence of my office, still my office, at least for tonight, and opened my laptop. While outwardly I maintained perfect composure, inside I was calculating, assessing, planning. Blake thought he knew me, thought he could predict my reaction, manage my disappointment, shuffle me into some meaningless role while he and Vanessa took over what I had built. But there was something Blake had forgotten about me, something essential to who I was. I hadn't risen from a modest background to a Wharton MBA and a successful consulting career by accepting other people's assessments of my worth. I hadn't transformed Horizon Tech from a failing startup to an $85 million company by backing down from challenges. I opened a document and began typing methodically, my fingers steady despite the emotional storm inside me. By dawn, I had compiled notes on everything I knew about the company's operations, contracts, client relationships, and financial structures. I knew where every piece of leverage existed. I knew which clients were loyal to me personally rather than to the Horizon brand. I knew which contracts had been signed under my authority. As the first rays of sun filtered through my office blinds, I closed my laptop and stood up. My reflection in the window showed a woman outwardly composed, designer dress still unwrinkled, makeup intact, posture perfect. No one looking at me would see the turmoil beneath, the rage and betrayal and determination swirling together into something potent and dangerous. I smoothed my dress, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and walked calmly to the elevator. As the doors closed, I made a silent promise to myself. Blake Harrison had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and I was going to make sure he knew it. The Four Seasons hotel room offered a panoramic view of Austin, the same skyline visible from Blake's penthouse. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up. I'd slept surprisingly well, exhaustion overriding even betrayal. My phone had been silent since 6 a.m. when I texted Blake the hotel information. No calls, no texts, no apologies, just as well. I needed clarity, not his excuses. A knock at the door announced room service with breakfast. I wasn't hungry, but I knew I needed fuel for what was coming. As I methodically cut into a perfectly poached egg, my mind crystallized the thoughts that had been forming since last night. This wasn't a sudden decision. This wasn't just about business expertise. This wasn't even primarily about Vanessa's qualifications, whatever Blake and the board might claim. This was about ownership, not legal ownership, though that would become important soon enough, but psychological ownership. In Blake's mind, Horizon Tech had always been his company. Not our company. Not my company. His. I had been permitted to build it, grow it, save it multiple times, but always as an extension of him. My contributions, no matter how essential, had always been viewed as service to his vision. My expertise had been welcome only as long as it supported his goals. The truth hit me with startling clarity. I had never been Blake's partner. I had been his most valuable employee. Loyal, hardworking, effective, but ultimately replaceable when someone shinier caught his attention. I opened my laptop and began researching. First, divorce attorneys with experience in high-net-worth cases involving shared business interests. Then, employment lawyers specializing in executive contracts. Finally, and most importantly, the details of my own contracts with Horizon Tech. When Blake and I had married, we'd signed a prenup. It had seemed reasonable at the time. He had founded the company before we met, and I had my own assets from my consulting career. The prenup specified that Horizon Tech would remain his separate property, but any appreciation in value during our marriage would be considered marital property, subject to equitable distribution. At the time of our marriage, the company had been valued at $7 million. Now it was worth $85 million on my employment. Contract was a different matter. When I formally took on the COO role in year 3, I had negotiated for equity, 5% of the company, vesting over 4 years. All of it had vested. I had another 2% from stock options granted as performance bonuses. 7% ownership, not nay. Controlling, but significant. And certainly not something Blake could ignore. But there was something else, something I had insisted on when we expanded internationally 3 years ago. As part of our corporate restructuring, I had been named the managing director of Horizon International, our global subsidiary that now accounted for 40% of total revenue. That entity had its own operating agreement with its own governance structure. I picked up my phone and called Marcus, our CFO. "Sarah," he answered immediately. "Are you okay? Last night was—" "I'm fine," I said, cutting off his concern. "I need information. Can you talk freely?" A pause. "I'm at home. Blake's called an emergency leadership meeting for 10 a.m., but I can be late." "Good. Tell me about Vanessa's contract. What's her actual start date?" He hesitated. "October 1st. But Sarah, and the board vote? When did they formally approve her appointment?" "Last week. It was unanimous, but—" He trailed off. "But what?" "But they didn't have all the information," he said quietly. "Blake presented it as, if you were on board with stepping down. He said you were focusing on the European expansion. Another piece of the puzzle. Another betrayal. One more thing," I said. "The clients we signed last quarter. The ones that pushed us over $80 million. Which entity are they contracted with? Horizon US or Horizon International?" "International," Marcus replied without hesitation. "You structured it that way for the tax benefits, remember? All new enterprise clients over a certain size go through international now." I did remember. I had designed it that way very deliberately. "Why? Are you asking about this?" Marcus questioned. "What are you planning?" "I'll see you at the 10 a.m. meeting," I replied, avoiding his question. "And Marcus, don't tell Blake we spoke." I ended the call and sat back, the truth of my situation becoming clearer. For years, I had defined myself as Blake's partner, as co-creator of Horizon Tech, even if legally my name wasn't on the founding documents. I had believed in our shared dream, our shared future. I had trusted that what we built together would always be ours together, but it never had been. There was a sudden clarity in this realization, painful but liberating. I had been living in an illusion, a beautiful, productive illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. And now that the veil had been lifted, I could see my situation with perfect clarity. Blake believed he held all the power. He believed I would accept whatever role he offered, because ultimately, it was his company. Vanessa believed the same, referring to me as a caretaker of something that belonged to him. But power isn't just about whose name is on the founding documents. It's about knowledge, relationships, systems, all the things invisible to those who haven't built them. I opened another browser tab and pulled up our client list, sorting by revenue contribution. Our top 5 clients represented 65% of our annual revenue. All 5 had been secured through my personal connections. All 5 had their primary relationships with me, not Blake. All 5 had contracts that included language about key personnel, specifically naming me as the essential Horizon contact. Another truth revealed itself. Blake didn't just need my acquiescence. He needed my active cooperation for this transition to succeed. Without it, Horizon Tech could quickly unravel, regardless of Vanessa's impressive resume. I checked the time. 8:45 a.m. The leadership meeting was at 10 bio. Blake would expect me to either not show up or arrive emotional, defensive, weakened by personal betrayal. I stood and walked to the closet where the hotel staff had hung the items Blake's assistant had dropped off. My fingers ran over the fabrics, searching for the right armor for today's battle. I selected a crimson sheath dress, powerful, eye-catching, unapologetic. I paired it with the Louboutins I reserved for closing major deals, the ones Blake always said were intimidatingly sexy. As I dressed, I thought about all the meetings I'd walked into over the years, feeling like I had to prove myself, like I was representing Blake, like my achievements reflected on him. Today would be different. Today I was representing only myself. Applied my makeup with precision, slightly stronger than my usual subtle look, but still professional. I swept my hair into a sleek chignon. Each action was deliberate, controlled, a physical manifestation of the clarity I now possessed. By 9:30, I stood before the mirror, examining my reflection. I looked powerful, composed, dangerous. The woman staring back at me was not a victim. She was not a caretaker about to be dismissed. She was someone who had built an $85 million business through intelligence, grit, and strategic thinking. She was someone who understood her own worth, and she was someone Blake Harrison was about to regret underestimating. I gathered my laptop and phone, slipped on dark sunglasses, and headed for the door. The truth had set me free, and now it was going to set me on fire. The Horizon Tech headquarters buzzed with unusual tension as I stepped off the elevator at 9:55 a.m. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Eyes darted toward me, then quickly away. Word had clearly spread about last night's announcement, but no one knew how to react to my presence. I smiled pleasantly at the front desk receptionist, who appeared visibly relieved that I wasn't causing a scene. "Good morning, Alyssa," I said, my voice steady and warm, as if this were any other Friday. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Yes, Ms. Reynolds," she stammered. "The leadership meeting is in the main conference room. They're already gathering." "Thank you," I replied, striding confidently toward the glass-walled room where I could see executives filtering in. Several turned to look as I approached. Their expressions ranged from sympathy to discomfort to poorly concealed curiosity. Blake stood at the head of the table, deep in conversation with our CTO. He glanced up as I entered, his expression flickering briefly with surprise before settling into careful neutrality. He had expected me not to show, or to show up disheveled, emotional, unprepared. Instead, I was immaculate, composed, radiating confidence. "Sarah," he acknowledged, his tone cautious, "I wasn't sure you'd join us today." "And miss our weekly leadership meeting?" I raised an eyebrow slightly. "I don't think so." I moved to my usual seat at the opposite end of the table, nodding professionally to colleagues as I passed. Marcus caught my eye, a question in his gaze that I answered with the slightest shake of my head. "Not now." Blake cleared his throat. "Let's get started." He glanced around the table. "I'm sure everyone has questions about last night's announcement, so let's address those first." All eyes shifted between Blake and me, the tension palpable. As I mentioned, Vanessa Peterson will be joining us as COO on October 1st. She'll be taking over operations, strategy, and client relationship management. This is a strategic move to position us for continued growth beyond the $100 million mark. He paused, perhaps expecting me to interject. I simply maintained a neutral expression, taking notes on my tablet as if this were a routine business discussion. I want to emphasize that this is not a reflection on Sarah's contributions, which have been invaluable to Horizon's success. Blake continued, sounding less confident. We're in discussions about a new role for her that will leverage her strengths, while allowing Vanessa to bring fresh perspectives to operations. Again, eyes flickered toward me. Again, I remained silent, my face revealing nothing of the calculations running through my mind. Blake shifted uncomfortably before continuing with the meeting agenda. Financial updates, product roadmap, marketing initiatives. I participated when appropriate, offering insights on upcoming client renewals, responding to questions about the European expansion, all with professional detachment. My silence regarding the elephant in the room was clearly unnerving Blake. Twice he attempted to engage me directly about the transition plan, and twice I redirected the conversation to operational matters, speaking with absolute authority about the business, reminding everyone in the room exactly who had been running Horizon Tech for nearly a decade. As the meeting concluded, Blake announced, "Sarah and I will be working out the details of the leadership transition over the coming days. I'd appreciate everyone's support during this period of change." I closed my tablet and stood. "I'll need the executive team's quarterly reports by end of day Monday for the board presentation," I said calmly. "And I'll be speaking with our top clients personally next week to ensure continuity." I glanced at Blake. Standard protocol for any significant leadership change. Before he could respond, I turned and walked out, feeling the weight of stunned gazes following me. I made my way to my office, closed the door, and finally allowed myself a moment to breathe. My phone buzzed almost immediately with a text from Blake. "My office. Now." I ignored it. 5 minutes later, another. "We need to talk, Sarah." I set the phone aside and turned to my computer. There were priorities far more important than Blake's need for confrontation. I emailed our corporate counsel, requesting an urgent meeting that afternoon. Then I reached out to the managing partner of Wilson and Hayes, the law firm I'd identified earlier that morning as specialists in high-net-worth divorces with business complications. A knock at my door. I knew who it was before he spoke. Sarah. Blake's voice was tight with controlled frustration. "We need to talk." I looked up from my computer, expression neutral. "I'm preparing for client calls. Can it wait until after lunch?" He stepped in, closing the door behind him. "No, it can't wait. What was that about in there?" "What was what?" I asked, my tone perfectly innocent. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, keeping his voice low but intense. "You're acting like nothing has changed." I tilted my head slightly. "Something has changed?" His jaw tightened. "Don't be childish. You know Vanessa is coming in as COO. You know we're restructuring your role." I leaned back in my chair, assessing him with new clarity. "Blake, I'm preparing for my regularly scheduled client calls. I'm drafting the board presentation. I'm doing my job, as I have for 9 years." I paused. "If there's going to be a change to that, I'll need it in writing. With specifics about my new role, compensation, reporting structure, and equity adjustments." He blinked, clearly taken aback by my businesslike approach. "This isn't just a contractual matter. This is about what's best for Horizon." "Is it?" I asked softly. "Of course it is. Vanessa brings expertise we need for our next phase of growth." "I see." I turned back to my computer, a clear dismissal. "As I said, I'll need the details in writing. Until then, I'll continue with my responsibilities." Blake stood there, seemingly at a loss. This wasn't the confrontation he had anticipated. No tears, no recriminations, no emotional leverage for him to exploit. "Sarah," he tried again, his tone softening. "I know this is difficult, but don't let personal feelings get in the way of what's good for the company." I looked up at him, meeting his gaze directly. "Personal feelings? Like reconnecting with your ex-girlfriend and secretly planning to install her in my position? Those kinds of personal feelings." A flash of guilt crossed his face. "That's not fair. I've explained that our connection is professional." "You've explained nothing, Blake. You've announced a decision and expected me to accept it without question." I kept my voice even, controlled. That's not how business partners handle major organizational changes. That's not how spouses treat each other. And that's certainly not how you treat someone who has given 9 years to building your company. He flinched at my emphasis on your company. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." "No," I said. "I'm making it exactly as difficult as it needs to be. Now, unless you have something specific to discuss about current operations, I have work to do." After a moment of tense silence, he turned and left, closing the door with controlled force, Not quite a slam, but enough to communicate his frustration. Alone again, I released a slow, steady breath. My heart was racing, but I had maintained absolute control. I hadn't given him the emotional reaction he expected. I hadn't resigned in a fit of betrayed dignity. I hadn't given him any reason to accelerate my removal or to claim I was being unprofessional. Instead, I had bought myself time. Time to speak with lawyers. Time to connect with key clients. Time to fully understand my leverage and how best to use it. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small leather notebook I'd kept since my first day at Horizon. In it, I had documented every major decision, every shift in strategy, every client relationship I'd personally secured. 9 years of building power I hadn't realized I would need until now. I flipped to a blank page and began writing with deliberate precision. September 13th. Blake announces Vanessa Peterson as COO, effective October 1st. No prior discussion with me, no transition plan provided, no specific new role defined, board apparently told I was in agreement, the facts, laid out clearly. No emotion, no interpretation, just reality as it had unfolded, the foundation for what would come next. My phone buzzed with a notification. The corporate counsel could meet at 2 p.m. The divorce attorney at 4:30 p.m. By end of day, I would have a clearer picture of my options. I closed the notebook and returned to preparing for my client calls. These relationships were my greatest source of leverage, and I needed to cement them before Vanessa arrived. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but out of strategic necessity. Blake had made his move, assuming I would either break down or step aside. He believed that because he had founded the company, because his name was first on the legal documents, he held all the power. But I knew better. Power wasn't just about legal ownership. It was about knowledge, relationships, and systems. All the things I had built while Blake was playing visionary and, apparently, reconnecting with his ex. I wouldn't react emotionally. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, I would respond strategically, deliberately, and with perfect clarity about what I was worth. And by the time I was done, Blake Harrison would understand exactly what he had lost. By 1:30 p.m., I had locked myself in a small conference room away from curious eyes. On the table before me lay the arsenal I had assembled, my laptop displaying company financial records, my phone with a list of key client contacts, stacks of printed agreements, and the legal pad where I had been methodically documenting my position within Horizon Tech. When you build a company from near bankruptcy to $85 million, you learn exactly where the power lies, and it's rarely where people think. Legal documents tell one story, operational reality tells another. I started with finances. As COO, I had extensive visibility into Horizon's capital structure. Blake owned 48% of the company. The Series A and B investors collectively held 35%. Key employees, including our CTO and CFO, had about 10% through various stock option programs, and I held 7%, small compared to Blake's stake, but significant enough to matter in any major decision. But ownership wasn't the only financial leverage. I had Horizon International, the subsidiary I directed, controlled 40% of our revenue, but required only 28% of our operating costs. In simple terms, the international division I built was significantly more profitable than our domestic business. Its cash flow had been subsidizing Blake's recent R&D passion projects, ones that had yet to generate meaningful returns. Next, I examined client relationships. Of our top 10 clients, I had personally secured 8 and maintained primary relationships with all 10. These clients collectively represented over 70% of our annual revenue. Each contract included language about key personnel, specifically naming me as the essential Horizon contact. If I left, Horizon would be legally obligated to notify these clients, giving them the right to reconsider their agreements. Our client retention rate under my leadership was 96%, far above industry standard. This wasn't just luck, it was because I had built systems and teams that delivered exceptional service, systems that Vanessa, regardless of her impressive resume, would take months to fully understand. Then there were the employees. I pulled up the organizational chart, highlighting those who reported directly to me and those whose loyalty I could count on. Marcus, our CFO, had been my hire. So had our VP of Client Services and Director of International Operations. Out of our 300 employees, at least 150 had been directly hired under my supervision. Many would be unsettled by my sudden demotion. I picked up my phone and texted Layla, our VP of Client Services. "Got time for coffee this afternoon? Need to discuss the Peterson transition." Her response came quickly. "Name the time and place, preferably off-site." I smiled slightly. Already the loyalties were becoming clear. Next, I opened our intellectual property portfolio. While Blake had developed the original algorithm that formed the basis of our flagship product, I had overseen the development of our client-facing applications, reporting systems, and integration frameworks. My name appeared on 6 of our 12 patents, either as inventor or co-inventor. The most recent, and most valuable, had me listed as primary inventor with Blake as secondary. I made a note to discuss IP ownership with the lawyers. Speaking of lawyers, I opened the company's legal document repository, which I had helped organize 3 years ago during a compliance overhaul. Blake's attention span for legal details was notoriously short, often signing agreements without fully reviewing them. This had created both vulnerabilities and opportunities. Vulnerabilities for the company, opportunities for me in this moment of crisis. I found what I was looking for in the operating agreement for Horizon International. When we'd established the subsidiary, I had insisted on a specific governance structure. While Horizon Tech was the majority shareholder, I had been named Managing Director with broad operational autonomy. The agreement required a supermajority vote to remove me from this position, meaning Blake would need board support, not just his founder authority. More importantly, there was a key person clause that I had insisted upon. If I ceased to be managing director for any reason other than voluntary resignation, a review of all international contracts would be triggered, requiring client approvals for the transition. At the time, Blake had viewed this as standard legal protection for the company. Now it was protection for me. By 1:55 p.m., I had compiled a comprehensive assessment of my resources and leverage points. The picture was clearer than I had initially hoped. Blake might own more equity, but I controlled relationships, operations, and key legal protections that gave me significant power. Power he had either forgotten about or never fully understood. At 2:00 p.m. sharp, Andrew Patel, our corporate counsel, knocked on the conference room door. I had always appreciated Andrew's professionalism and discretion, but today, those qualities were essential. "Sarah," he said, taking a seat across from me. "Unusual circumstances." "Indeed," I replied, closing my laptop. "Thank you for making time, on short notice." "Of course," he set his legal pad on the table. "I understand you have questions about the leadership transition." "I have questions about my legal position within Horizon Tech," I clarified. "The leadership situation is a separate matter." He nodded, understanding the distinction. "What specifically are you concerned about?" "I need clarity on several points. First, my position as Managing Director of Horizon International and the protections afforded by the operating agreement. Second, the implications of the key person clauses in our major client contracts. Third, my rights regarding intellectual property I've developed or co-developed during my tenure. Andrew's expression remained neutral, but I detected a flicker of concern. He had helped draft many of these agreements and understood their implications. "I should note," he said carefully, "that as corporate counsel, I represent Horizon Tech, not individual executives. I'm aware, I replied. I've scheduled a meeting with outside counsel later today. But before I discuss these matters with them, I wanted to ensure my understanding of the current agreements is accurate. As an officer of the company, I have a fiduciary duty to understand my legal position, wouldn't you agree? He paused, then nodded. That's reasonable. Let's start with Horizon International. For the next hour, Andrew and I reviewed the key agreements. He was thorough and objective, pointing out both the strengths and limitations of my position. He couldn't advise me on strategy, his loyalty was to the company, but he could confirm the facts of the legal landscape. By the time our meeting concluded, I had confirmation of what I'd suspected. I was in a much stronger position than Blake. Realized, not invulnerable certainly, but far from powerless. One last question, Andrew, I said as he gathered his materials. Has Blake consulted you about the transition plan? Specifically about my legal rights and the potential implications for the company? Andrew hesitated, weighing his professional obligations. I can say that the consultation on this matter has been less comprehensive than I would have recommended. Translation. Blake hadn't done his homework. He had made a major organizational decision based on personal desire rather than strategic assessment. After Andrew left, I had 30 minutes before my scheduled coffee with Layla. I used the time to draft an email to our 5 largest clients, casually mentioning that I'd like to schedule calls with each of them next week to discuss some organizational updates. At Horizon, nothing alarming, nothing that breached any confidentiality or suggested crisis. Just a gentle reminder that I was their primary relationship manager and would be personally keeping them informed. As I pressed send, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Blake called me into his office, asked about your mood, your plans. I kept it vague. Watch your back. I texted back. Thank you. Keep your options open. Marcus would understand what I meant. In the coming battle, everyone would need to choose sides. I was giving him permission to protect himself, regardless of which way things went. I gathered my materials, straightened my crimson dress, and headed for the elevator. As I waited, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflective doors. I looked composed, professional, formidable. Blake had always seen me as his lieutenant, his supporter, the one who executed his vision. He had forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, that I had built much of this company with my own hands. That the systems and relationships that made Horizon Tech valuable were as much mine as his. That was his first mistake. His second was bringing Vanessa Peterson back into his life. And his third, his most critical error, was assuming I would simply accept his decision and step aside. The elevator doors opened. As I stepped in, I made a silent promise to myself. By the time this was over, Blake Harrison would understand exactly how much power I truly held. The downtown cafe was busy with Friday afternoon patrons, providing perfect cover for my conversation with Layla. We chose a corner table, ordered coffees, and spoke in the measured tones of executives discussing business strategy, nothing that would attract attention from nearby tables. So it's true, Layla said, stirring her latte. Blake's ex is taking over as COO. October 1st, apparently, I confirmed, though I only learned about it last night along with everyone else. Layla's expression darkened. That's unprofessional, to put it mildly. Indeed. I took a sip of my coffee. What's the team saying? They're confused, concerned. You built our client services division from scratch. No one understands why you'd be sidelined, especially for someone with no history with our clients. I nodded, unsurprised. What about you? Be honest. Layla met my gaze directly. I came to Horizon because of you, Sarah. Most of my team did too. We believe in your vision for client relationships. If that changes... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I appreciate your candor, I said. Then, carefully, I may need your help in the coming weeks. Things could get complicated. You have it, she said without hesitation. Just tell me what you need. This was the foundation of true power, not stock certificates or titles, but trust, built over years of leadership. Blake had overlooked this critical asset in his calculations. After parting with Layla, I headed to my 4:30 appointment with Catherine Chen of Wilson & Hayes. Her office projected exactly the kind of understated wealth and power I needed in legal representation, modern, minimalist, with views overlooking the city. Ms. Reynolds, she greeted me, gesturing to a chair. Your situation sounds intriguing. It's about to become more so, I replied, setting my portfolio on her desk and opening it to reveal the document I hadn't shown anyone yet. The document that would change everything. Catherine examined it carefully, then looked up with newfound interest. This is unexpected. For everyone, it seems, I said with a small smile. The document was a supplemental agreement Blake and I had signed 3 years ago during a particularly tumultuous period for Horizon. We'd been fighting for a government contract that would either make or break our international expansion. Blake had been focused on technology development, leaving me to manage the high-stakes bid process. When we won the contract, entirely through my efforts, Blake had been both grateful and apparently momentarily aware of his dependence on me. In a rare moment of foresight, we had drafted and signed an agreement stipulating that any major organizational change affecting my position would require mutual consent. At the time, it had seemed like a formality, a gesture of partnership. Blake had likely forgotten about it entirely. I hadn't. This is legally binding, Catherine confirmed, examining the notarized signatures. It effectively gives you veto power over any attempt to remove you or substantially change your role without your consent. I thought so, I said calmly. Why haven't you mentioned this to Mr. Harrison yet? She asked, curious rather than judgmental. Strategic. Timing, I replied simply. I needed to understand my complete position first. Catherine nodded appreciatively. And now? Now I need a comprehensive strategy. One that protects my interests whether I stay with Horizon or negotiate an exit. One that recognizes both my legal position and my practical leverage through client and employee relationships. And your marriage? She asked carefully. I met her gaze steadily. My husband invited his ex-girlfriend to replace me in the company. I built while keeping me in the dark until a public announcement. The marriage is a secondary concern at this point. She nodded, understanding perfectly. We'll need to coordinate the business strategy with a divorce strategy. I have a colleague who specializes in high-net-worth divorces with business entanglements. Perfect, I said. And I need this handled quickly. Blake expects me to spend the weekend processing my emotions. By Monday morning, I want to be ready to act. Catherine smiled slightly. He clearly doesn't know who he's dealing with. No, I agreed. He doesn't. But he's about to find out. As I left Catherine's office, the weight of the document in my portfolio felt like armor. Blake had made a critical miscalculation. He had assessed my legal position based solely on standard company agreements, overlooking the special protection we had created during that government contract push. It was the hidden advantage he never saw coming, and it would change everything. The weekend passed with calculated precision. Blake called repeatedly on Saturday, his messages evolving from demanding, "We need to talk about this transition," to conciliatory, "Let's work this out together," to concerned, "At least let me know you're okay." I responded only once, late. Saturday evening. I need time to process. We'll be in the office Monday. This radio silence wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Every hour Blake spent wondering about my next move was an hour he spent off balance, uncertain, reactive rather than proactive. I spent Saturday in Catherine Chen's office with her team, developing a comprehensive strategy. Sunday was dedicated to calling 5 key clients, ostensibly to check in on implementation progress, but actually to subtly reinforce our relationships before Monday's confrontation. By Sunday evening, I had assembled my arsenal. First, the legal documentation. The supplemental agreement was my nuclear option, but Catherine had identified several other leverage points. My role as managing director of Horizon International, the key person clauses in major client contracts, and my significant IP contributions. Second, the business leverage. I had emailed each executive team member requesting their quarterly reports for the board presentation I'm preparing, subtly reinforcing my authority. I had reviewed every major upcoming contract renewal and revenue projection, arming myself with precise knowledge of Horizon's financial dependencies. Third, the human capital. Discreet conversations with Layla and 2 other loyal executives had confirmed what I suspected. Significant portions of the team would be unsettled by my removal, especially in favor of an outsider with no history at Horizon. Fourth, the exit strategy. If reconciliation proved impossible, Catherine had prepared a comprehensive separation proposal that would protect my interests while minimizing disruption to the company. A document that positioned me as the reasonable party focused on Horizon's well-being, not personal grievance. Monday morning arrived clear and bright. I dressed with deliberate care, a navy suit that projected authority without aggression, subtle jewelry that spoke of confidence rather than flash. I arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m., a full hour before Blake typically arrived, and proceeded directly to the executive conference room rather than my office. I had the room set up precisely as I wanted, my materials arranged at the head of the table, water and coffee service prepared, blinds adjusted to prevent glare on my presentation materials. The physical environment itself would communicate that I was in control of this meeting. At 7:45, Marcus arrived, looking surprised to find me already there. "Early start," he observed cautiously. "Important day," I replied, sliding a folder toward him. "I'd appreciate your review of these projections before the others arrive." He glanced at the documents, forecasts showing how Horizon International's revenue would be affected by leadership disruption. His eyebrows rose slightly. "These are stark." "They're accurate," I corrected gently, "based on historical client behavior during leadership transitions." At 8:10, Blake walked in, stopping abruptly when he saw me seated at the head of the table. Marcus was to my right, reviewing documents. Layla had arrived moments before and taken a seat to my left. "Sarah," Blake said, his tone a mixture of surprise and wariness. "I didn't expect. I thought we'd talk privately first." "Good morning, Blake," I replied pleasantly. "I thought it would be more efficient to address the leadership transition with the executive team present. After all, it affects everyone." His eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed the room setup, the confident postures of Marcus and Layla flanking me, the stack of documents arranged neatly before me. This wasn't the scenario he had anticipated. He had expected to find me in my office, perhaps emotional, perhaps resigned, certainly defensive. Instead, I had claimed the power position and was clearly prepared to lead the conversation. "The rest of the team will be here at 8:30, I continued, gesturing to an empty chair. "But I thought you and I could align on the agenda first." Blake hesitated, then took a seat, not at the other end of the table where he typically sat during executive meetings, but halfway down, as if trying to maintain some physical distance from whatever I had prepared. "You've been busy," he observed, nodding toward the documents. "I have," I agreed. 9 years of building this company taught me to be thorough." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. For the first time since his announcement about Vanessa, Blake Harrison looked genuinely concerned about what was coming. Next, he should be. The stage was set, the players were in position, and I was about to change the game entirely. By 8:30, The conference room had filled with our executive team. The tension was palpable as conversations halted mid-sentence when I stood to address the room. Blake sat with forced casualness, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed his concern. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady and authoritative. "As you know, during Thursday's dinner, Blake announced that Vanessa Peterson will be joining Horizon as COO on October 1st, taking over operations, strategy, and client relationships." I paused, scanning the faces around the table. What you may not know is that this decision was made without my knowledge or input, despite my role as current COO and co-builder of this company. A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged. Our CTO, Dave, shifted awkwardly in his seat. "Blake believes this transition is what's best for Horizon's future," I continued. "And that may well be true. However, any significant leadership change requires careful planning to minimize disruption to operations and client relationships." Blake leaned forward. "Sarah?" I held up a hand, politely but firmly. "I'll address questions after I've outlined the situation." The small gesture, and Blake's instinctive compliance with it, immediately established who was controlling this meeting. I distributed folders to each executive. Inside, you'll find 3 documents. First, an assessment of how leadership transitions have historically affected companies in our sector. Second, an analysis of our client contracts that include key person clauses naming me specifically. And third, a proposed transition plan that would protect Horizon's interests regardless of who serves as COO going forward. As they opened their folders, I clicked to the first slide of my presentation. It showed Horizon's growth curve over 9 years, with key milestones I had personally led highlighted in red. The visual impact was undeniable. Nearly every significant jump in revenue or valuation corresponded with an initiative I had spearheaded. "I've spent the weekend reviewing our position," I said. "Not out of emotion, but out of duty to this company and the people in this room." I moved to the next slide, which outlined client relationship risks. Our top 5 clients represent 70% of our annual revenue. All 5 have contracts that name me as a key relationship manager. Any transition that removes me from these relationships triggers notification clauses that allow them to reassess their contracts with us. Marcus nodded, already aware of this from our earlier conversation. Dave looked increasingly concerned. Furthermore, I continued, Horizon International, which represents 40% of our revenue but only 28% of our costs, operates under my direction as managing director. Its operating agreement includes specific governance provisions that limit changes to this arrangement. I could see Blake's expression darkening as he realized I was methodically laying out the business case against his hasty decision. Not emotional. Appeals, but hard facts about risk and value. I moved to the third slide. A timeline of intellectual property development. 6 of our 12 patents list me as inventor or co-inventor, including our newest analytics framework, which is projected to drive 30% of new revenue over the next 2 years. The room had gone completely silent. This wasn't the conversation anyone had expected, least of all Blake, who was now sitting rigidly in his chair, his earlier casual posture abandoned. I clicked to the final slide. A simple header reading, Options. Moving forward. "I see 3 possibilities," I said calmly. "First, we proceed with Blake's plan to bring in Vanessa Peterson as COO, with me transitioning to another role. Second, we maintain the current leadership structure with appropriate adjustments to address the growth needs Blake has identified. Or third, we negotiate a separation that protects both my interests and Horizon's future." I paused, letting the options settle in the room. Before we discuss these alternatives, however, there's one additional document you should all be aware of. This was the moment. I reached into my portfolio and removed the supplemental agreement, sliding it across. To Marcus first. 3 years ago, when we were pursuing the government contract that ultimately funded our international expansion, Blake and I signed this agreement. I kept my tone matter of fact, as if discussing an ordinary business matter rather than the bombshell it represented. It stipulates that any major organizational change affecting my position requires mutual consent. Marcus's eyebrows shot up as he scanned the document, then passed it to Dave. The paper made its way around the table, finally reaching Blake, who stared at it with dawning recognition. "I had forgotten about this," he admitted quietly. I hadn't. I replied simply. The power in the room had shifted tangibly. What had begun as Blake's unilateral decision, his company, his rules, had transformed into a negotiation where I held significant legal and practical leverage. To be perfectly clear, I continued, I'm not opposed to bringing in additional leadership talent as we scale beyond $100 million. What I am opposed to is being blindsided by decisions that affect both my professional standing and the stability of this company. Blake cleared his throat. The board supports bringing Vanessa on as COO. The board was told I was on board with stepping down, I countered. Were they informed of this agreement? Were they given a risk assessment of client and revenue impact if I were removed from key relationships? His silence was answer enough. Layla spoke up. From a client perspective, any transition that removes Sarah from key accounts represents significant risk. These relationships were built personally by her over years. Dave nodded. And on the IP side, Sarah's knowledge of our patent portfolio and ongoing development is, well, irreplaceable in the short term. One by one, the executives added their assessments, each highlighting an aspect of my value to Horizon that Blake had seemingly discounted. Not because they were taking sides in a marital dispute, but because they were executives protecting their company's interests. Blake's expression cycled through frustration, surprise, and finally resignation as he realized the full extent of his miscalculation. He had assumed his authority as founder and majority shareholder would be sufficient. He had forgotten that modern companies are not monarchies. They are complex ecosystems of relationships, knowledge, and legal protections. "What do you want, Sarah?" he finally asked, his tone notably different from the patronizing one he had used days earlier when offering me a lesser role. I closed my laptop and leaned forward slightly. I want what's best for Horizon Tech. That's what I've wanted for 9 years. I paused. But I also want my contributions respected and my role acknowledged. The room fell silent, all eyes moving between Blake and me. The power dynamic had completely reversed. He had entered this meeting, indeed this entire situation, believing he held all the cards. Now he was the one on the defensive, trying to salvage his plans in the face of the leverage I had methodically revealed. "I suggest we take a 20-minute break," I said, standing smoothly. "When we return, we can discuss constructive options for moving forward." As the room cleared, Blake remained seated, staring at the supplemental agreement still in front of him. I paused at the door. "For what it's worth," I said quietly, "I would have been open to discussing bringing Vanessa on board in some capacity. What I wasn't open to was being ambushed and replaced without so much as a conversation." He looked up, finally seeing me, really seeing me, perhaps for the first time in years. Not as his supportive wife, not as his loyal employee, but as a formidable business partner who had built as much of this company as he had. "I underestimated you," he said simply. "Yes," I agreed. "You did." And with that, I walked out, leaving him alone with the realization that the game had changed entirely, and I was now the one setting the rules. The executive team reconvened 20 minutes later to find the dynamic fundamentally altered. Blake had moved from his middle-of-the-table position to the far end, a physical acknowledgement of the new power balance. I remained at the head, my position now legitimized by more than just strategic seating arrangements. "I'd like to propose a path forward," I began, opening a new document on my laptop and projecting it onto the screen. "One that addresses both Blake's desire to bring in fresh leadership for our next growth phase and my continued role in the company I've helped build. Blake leaned forward, his expression guarded but attentive. This was no longer his meeting. To control. Horizon should be restructured into 2 divisions, I explained, revealing an organizational chart. Horizon Domestic, focusing on our U.S. operations and new product development, and Horizon International, encompassing our global operations and client relationships. The chart showed Blake as CEO of the parent company, with 2 president positions beneath him, one for each division. Vanessa could join as president of Horizon Domestic, leveraging her expertise in scaling domestic operations and new product launches. I would formalize my role as president of Horizon International, continuing to oversee our fastest-growing and most profitable segment. Murmurs of consideration rippled around the table. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. It acknowledged Blake's desire for new leadership while preserving my authority in the area I had built most successfully. Both divisions would report to the CEO, with clear delineation of responsibilities and revenue targets, I continued. This creates a natural competitive dynamic that could drive overall growth while allowing each division to play to its strengths. Marcus nodded appreciatively. The financial structure makes sense. International is already functionally separate in our reporting. Dave, our CTO, looked thoughtful. We'd need to clarify technology resource allocation between divisions. Absolutely. I agreed. I've outlined that in Section 3 of the proposal. Blake remained silent, studying the organizational chart with an unreadable expression. Layla voiced what several were likely thinking. This seems like a reasonable compromise that could actually strengthen our overall position. There's one more element, I added, clicking to the next slide. Equity adjustment. The room tensed slightly. Money and ownership, always the most sensitive topics. The current ownership structure doesn't reflect my contributions to Horizon's growth, I said matter-of-factly. I'm proposing an equity adjustment that increases my stake to 15%, drawn proportionally from existing shareholders. Blake's head snapped up. 15%? That's more than double your current position. It is, I acknowledged calmly, and it's still significantly less than the value I've created. The company was worth $7 million when I joined. It's now valued at $85 million. Much of that growth came directly from initiatives I led. Before Blake could respond, Marcus interjected. From a purely financial perspective, the proposed equity adjustment is actually quite reasonable based on contribution to value creation. Blake's eyes narrowed slightly. He was recalculating, reassessing, looking for counter-moves. I had expected this. What about Vanessa? He finally asked. She was expecting the COO role for the entire company. She'll have autonomy over domestic operations with significant growth potential, I replied. If her expertise is as valuable as you believe, she should welcome the opportunity to prove it with clear P&L responsibility, a subtle challenge embedded in a reasonable response. Blake caught it, his lips tightening momentarily. I'll need to discuss this with the board, he said, his first defensive maneuver. Of course, I agreed smoothly. I've prepared a board presentation outlining both the strategic rationale and risk mitigation aspects of this proposal. Shall we review it tomorrow morning? I've already requested time on their calendar. His eyebrows rose fractionally. I had anticipated his move and countered it before he even made it. I had spent Sunday afternoon reaching out to 2 board members I knew well, planting seeds about organizational options that would maximize stability during growth. Fine, he conceded. Tomorrow morning. As the meeting concluded, Blake lingered, behind while the others filed out. When we were alone, he looked at me with a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. You know this isn't just about business, he said quietly. No, I agreed. It's about respect. It's about partnership. It's about 9 years of building something together only to be discarded without consultation. He flinched slightly at the word discarded. I never meant to. Your intentions are less relevant than your actions, I interrupted, keeping my tone professional despite the personal undercurrent. And your actions made it clear how you value my contribution, both to the company and to our marriage. For a moment, vulnerability broke through his business facade. Can we fix this? Us? I gathered my materials, considering his question with the same careful assessment I'd given every other aspect of this situation. The company? Yes. With the right structure and clear boundaries, I said finally. The marriage? That remains to be seen. I walked out, leaving Blake with the understanding that while I was open to salvaging our business relationship, our personal one would require much more than a convenient organizational compromise. The next 2 weeks unfolded with the precision of a meticulously choreographed business operation. The board meeting had gone exactly as I'd planned. My presentation left little room for objection when presented with the stark alternatives. Proceed with Blake's original plan and risk client defection, intellectual property complications, and possible legal challenges, or adopt my restructuring proposal that protected Horizon's stability while allowing for fresh leadership in domestic operations. By Friday of that week, the board had unanimously approved the restructuring and my equity increase to 15%. Blake, recognizing he had few viable alternatives, had ultimately supported the proposal while negotiating minor adjustments to division responsibilities. Now, 3 weeks after that fateful dinner announcement, I stood in the newly renovated executive wing, watching as the facilities team installed frosted glass doors with new signage. Sarah Reynolds, President. Horizon International, across the hall, another office was being prepared for. Vanessa Peterson, President. Horizon Domestic. She would be starting next Monday, a week later than originally planned. Blake had informed me of the delayed start during one of our now strictly professional interactions, carefully avoiding any mention of their personal history. I had simply nodded and updated my transition timeline accordingly. The personal side of our relationship remained in suspended animation. I had moved from the Four Seasons to a furnished corporate apartment, bringing only essential items from our shared penthouse. Blake had attempted several conversations about us, each met with the same response. I'm focusing on the business transition right now. Personal matters will have to wait. It wasn't avoidance, it was prioritization, and perhaps a bit of warranted emotional distance while I reassessed what I wanted from my marriage, if anything at all. Marcus appeared at my side, observing the new office setup. Quite the turnaround, he commented. 3 weeks ago, you were being shown the door. Now you've got a bigger office and a better title. And double the equity, I added with a small smile. That too. He hesitated. Blake's been different since all this happened. More thoughtful. Less impulsive in decision-making. I nodded. Nothing like nearly losing $85 million in company value to inspire reflection. We shared a knowing look. While we had never explicitly discussed it, Marcus understood that the restructuring had been about more than just titles and reporting lines. It had been about establishing respect, demonstrating value, and creating consequences for dismissing my contributions. The organization chart went out this morning, he said. Reactions have been overwhelmingly positive. People understand the logic of splitting domestic and international. Few questions about Vanessa, more curiosity than concern. And the clients? The 5 I've spoken with are relieved you're staying. 2 specifically mentioned they wouldn't. Have been comfortable if you'd left. This was the validation that mattered most. Confirmation that my value to Horizon wasn't just something I had manufactured for leverage, but a reality recognized by those who mattered most to our business. Later. That afternoon, I met with Layla and our international team leads to discuss the transition. What had begun as a necessary damage control operation had evolved into an opportunity to reshape how Horizon approached global markets. With dedicated resources and clearer decision-making authority, we can move faster on the European expansion, I explained, outlining my vision for Horizon International. No more competing with domestic priorities for attention and investment. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of excitement about the new structure and relief that the leadership upheaval had resulted in a stronger, more focused organization. After the meeting, I returned to my new office to find Blake waiting, examining the view from windows that overlooked the western hills beyond Austin. "Nice upgrade," he observed, gesturing to the spacious office. "Better than the old one." "Different," I corrected. "Appropriate for the role." He nodded, turning to face me. "The press release goes out tomorrow morning. Horizon Tech announces strategic restructuring to support global growth. All positive framing, as you requested." "Thank you," I said, setting my tablet on the desk that would be installed tomorrow. "I wanted to let you know." He hesitated, then continued. "I spoke with Vanessa yesterday. Explained the new structure and her role. She's accepting of the changes." I raised an eyebrow. "Just accepting?" A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "She had questions about your involvement in the decision. I was transparent about the fact that the restructuring was your idea, and that it was ultimately better for the company." I appreciated his honesty, even if it had come weeks too late. "And how did she take that?" "Professionally," he said after a moment. "She understands business realities." "As do I replied evenly. Blake took a deep breath. "Sarah, about us." "Blake." I interrupted gently. "We've established a good working framework for the company. I'm proud of that. But our personal relationship requires more thought than I've had time to give it these past weeks." He nodded slowly, accepting this boundary, as he had been forced to accept many others since that confrontational meeting. "For what it's worth," he said quietly. "I've realized many things about myself, about us, about how I've taken your contributions for granted. Not just at Horizon, but in our life together." It was the most genuine thing he'd said since this ordeal began. I acknowledged it with a slight nod. "Time and actions will tell," I said, neither accepting nor rejecting his implicit apology. "For now, let's focus on making this restructuring successful." As he left, I turned to look out at the same hills he had been contemplating. 3 weeks ago, my professional identity and personal life had been thrown into chaos by a single announcement at a celebration dinner. Now I stood in a larger office, with a president's title, doubled equity, and clear authority over the division I had built. It wasn't the outcome Blake had intended when he'd decided to bring Vanessa back into our lives. But it was the outcome I had engineered through strategic thinking, leveraging my value, and refusing to be discarded. The new order at Horizon Tech was established. My role in it was secure, and for the first time in 9 years, I was operating, not as an extension of Blake's vision, but as the architect of my own. 6 months after that fateful dinner announcement, I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse, watching the Austin skyline shimmer in the evening light. So much had changed, yet the city remained the same, constantly growing, evolving, reinventing itself, much like I had. Horizon International had exceeded all projections under my leadership, securing 3 major European clients and expanding into Asian markets ahead of schedule. My division now contributed 55% of the company's overall revenue, with profit margins consistently outperforming the domestic operation. Vanessa, to her credit, had adapted to her role with professional focus. Whatever personal history remained between her and Blake stayed out of company operations. We maintained a cordial, distant relationship, 2 executives respecting each other's domains while competing quietly for resources and recognition. Blake and I had finally had our personal reckoning 2 months after the restructuring. The conversation was neither bitter nor reconciliatory, simply honest. We acknowledged that while we had built an extraordinary company together, we had failed to maintain the same care and attention to our marriage. The trust, once broken, proved difficult to repair. The divorce was finalized last month. Like everything else in my life now, I had approached it strategically, without emotion clouding my judgment. My 15% stake in Horizon remained intact, along with my position as president of Horizon International. The prenup's provision about company appreciation during our marriage had worked in my favor, resulting in a fair financial settlement that acknowledged my role in building Blake's initial vision into an industry leader. My phone vibrated with a text from Marcus. Singapore team just landed the Matsura account. $8 annual contract, 3-year minimum. I smiled, texting back a quick congratulation. Another victory for International. Another validation of the path I'd chosen. In the distance, I could see the Horizon Tech building, its top floors illuminated against the darkening sky. When I'd first walked into that converted warehouse 9 years ago, I could never have imagined the journey ahead. The triumphant growth, the painful betrayal, the strategic rebuilding, and finally, this new independence. The woman who had once defined herself as Blake Harrison's wife and partner had transformed into something more self-contained, more confident. I had discovered something profound in those weeks of crisis. My value wasn't tied to my relationship with Blake, or even to Horizon itself. It was inherent in my skills, my vision, my ability to build and lead. Tomorrow, I would fly to London to finalize our European headquarters location. Next month, I'd present my 3-year expansion strategy to the board, a plan already generating excitement among investors. My professional future had never looked brighter or more firmly under my own control. As for my personal life, that too was mine to shape now, without the shadow of betrayal or the weight of unequal partnership. I had learned to value myself in ways I never had before, to recognize my worth independent of others' validation. The lesson had been painful, but essential. No one can take what you truly own: your talents, your vision, your determination. Blake had tried to replace me, thinking the company was solely his to control. Instead, he had inadvertently forced me to claim my full power and value. I raised my glass to the glittering skyline, to the future I was building on my own terms. Sometimes the greatest gift your adversaries can give you is the opportunity to discover just how formidable you truly are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.